Chapter 13. All for the Best. The final words in the preamble to the Memorandum of Agreements between Canada and Newfoundland of December 11th, 1948, state that the terms of union have been settled by authorized representatives of Canada and authorized representatives of Newfoundland. But are these words true? The official designation of authorized representatives goes to the heart of the Anglo-Canadian plot to deprive Newfoundland of its right to actual self-determination. The statement flaunts an equality between the representatives of both countries, which was simply non-existent. The Canadian representatives were certainly authorized by the elected governor of Canada, with all the power necessary to confederate with Newfoundland. But who had authorized the Newfoundland delegation? The National Convention elected in Newfoundland in 1946 had authority to only discuss and recommend, and specifically not to decide or negotiate. Beyond that, only 4 of the 7 delegates to Ottawa were elected delegates to that convention. Albert Walsh, chairman of the delegation, was a commissioner in the Commission of Government that had been rejected in the first referendum, while Gordon Winter and Philip Grunchy had simply been picked out of private life by the governor. The Newfoundland representatives were authorized by the Commission of Government and by the British governor, who chose them, and would be, as the governor put it, the right sort of people with whom the Canadians could deal. None of them had any authority to sign over the sovereignty of their country to Canada. That authority was suddenly granted to them by the British government that had appointed them. The terms of union with Canada were accepted by the British government, that the proposed terms be reported with recommendations for adoption by the Newfoundland delegation to the governor in commission, which will approve and recommend that they be brought into effect by the United Kingdom's statute. The final Canadian terms were never debated, approved, or ratified by any elected Newfoundland body, certainly not by the Newfoundland legislature. It has been suspended by the British in 1933, and it was kept suspended until Confederation with Canada was complete. The setup was confirmed by R.A. Mackay, the chairman of the steering subcommittee of the Interdepartmental Committee of Newfoundland. On September 30th, 1948, in his memo to the status of the Newfoundland delegation, the delegation last year consisted of the Committee of the National Convention, and it was empowered only to inquire whether a fair and equitable basis of union existed. The present delegation will be expressly empowered to negotiate on behalf of Newfoundland. The word negotiate is used in the Prime Minister's statement of July 30th, 1948. Mackay might seem very proud of the inclusion of the word negotiate, but he continued, "The present delegation should, however, be regarded as representatives of the Commission of Government, which has reserved to itself the position of principal in the negotiations." The Dominion's office had ruled early on in this bizarre experiment in dictatorship that the Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs was sovereign in all spheres over the Commission of government in St. John's. The Canadians were therefore negotiating not with any Newfoundland authority, but with the British government. The improvised constitutional device of the National Convention and the appointed delegation had been merely a pseudo-democratic screen to set up a conceal the real actions between London and Ottawa. Although the Commission of Government reserved to itself the position of principal in the negotiations between Newfoundland and Canada, at no point in the long and painful process did the Commission of Government or the Commonwealth Relations Office ever question the Canadian terms. Never once did any of their officials say these terms were unfair or inadequate in any respect. The only opinion of the British ever expressed about them was that they were extremely generous, even though it was known that the new province would not be able to exist under them. Clearly, there were some British officials who sincerely believed that what they were doing in Newfoundland was the best possible solution. Without doubt, arranging for Newfoundland to enter into Confederation with Canada was a convenient and tidy resolution for the United Kingdom. True democracy, however, is rarely so convenient. When the Newfoundland electorate rejected Confederation in 1889, Governor Hill in Ottawa suggested to the Colonial Secretary, Lord Granville, that it should be imposed on Newfoundland. Lord Granville replied that the only way Newfoundland could join Canada was by action of the elected Newfoundland legislature, as laid out in the British North American Act of 1867. The Newfoundland Act of 1949 set the B&A Act aside and established a new precedent. Before the debate on the Newfoundland Act in the British Parliament in March 1949, Sir Alan Herbert received a summary of the situation in Newfoundland, prepared by the Conservative Party. The conclusion read, "The verdict is likely to be the right thing done in the wrong way." The majority of the written commentaries on Newfoundland's union with Canada in 1949 have concluded that despite collusion, deception, and impropriety, it was all for the best. As Peter Neri put it, arguably Newfoundland found greater independence within the loose structure of Canadian federalism than it could ever have achieved on its own. All this, of course, means nothing if one believes, as an article of faith, that Newfoundland was a victim of an Anglo-Canadian plot. But the entire point of the Anglo-Canadian plot was to deprive Newfoundland of regaining self-government and of representing its own interests with Canada on its own authority. Whether the delegates would have negotiated better or worse terms is simply not the point. As a people, Newfoundlanders had the right to self-determination, not British or Canadian determinations. To say that manipulation of the democratic process in Newfoundland by British and Canada was all for the best would have us accept that the end does justify the means, and that might make right and give comfort to the same condescending and paternalistic attitudes which informed the Amerley Report and led to the destruction of Newfoundland's democracy and reputation in 1933. Self-determination is, after all, the only protection against the actions of even well-meaning outsiders and autocrats. Commissioner Thomas Lodge, in condemning the entire British scheme in Newfoundland, concluded, the Amberley Royal Commission had been misled in concluding that Newfoundland's ill had stemmed from corrupt and spendthrift administrations rather than from economic causes beyond her control. From this misconception sprung all other errors in judgment on the part of the British government. History requires that rather than trusting blindly in the motives of even benevolent dictators, we examine their actions with a jaundiced eye. We cannot know whether Newfoundland would have been better off as a province of Canada than as an independent country. What we can know is the truth about how it was done, or we can at least come closer to it. That truth was kept from the Newfoundland and Canadian public for almost half a century, and it needs now to be acknowledged, to change minds, and to improve attitudes. In June 1947, Clifford Clark, the Deputy Minister of Finance, marked to American diplomat. In June 1947, Clifford Clark, the Deputy Minister of Finance, remarked to American diplomat Joshua Harrington that he was afraid Newfoundland as a Canadian province would be a little Ireland, full of disgruntled people. He was not alone in his concern, and, not surprisingly, there has been discontent ever since on both sides. Given the way the deal was made, it would be incomprehensible if there were not. In all my research on the theme, I have read and heard nothing good about the way Newfoundland's entry into Confederation was handled. The most commonly used words or phrases to describe it are underhanded, dishonest, patronizing, improper, shabby, badly done, and an unholy deal. Whether the process was legal and binding may still be open to debate, and if it were to be declared strictly legal, it would be so only because Great Britain wrote the law and could make it so. They could unilaterally void one law, the British North American Act of 1867, by writing another, the British North American Act of 1949, and vary the terms of Newfoundland Act of 1933 without the contest of the original party to that agreement. It was this particular legal action that troubled Kenneth Ware and other constitutional experts after the Imperial Conference of 1926. The Parliament of Great Britain could no longer pass laws affecting the Dominions without the consent of the Parliament of those Dominions. Newfoundland's Dominion status was in suspension, and the Parliament of Great Britain could not pass the British North American Act of 1949 to irrevocably change the status, the Dominion of Newfoundland without the consent of the Parliament of Newfoundland. The right of the British Parliament to pass such an act and the legality of the act itself are issues that have never been adequately resolved. In returning responsible government to Newfoundland, There would have been no winners and no losers, merely the fulfillment of a contract and an occasion of great satisfaction and rejoice. The elected Newfoundland government would have been a powerful body. By the calculations of the Finance Committee of the National Convention and an analysis by the Daily News, among others, an independent government in 1949 would have had surplus of over 40 million, an exception of reasonable prosperity for the near future, and no desperate need to join up with anybody. Alexander Clutterbuck and Philip Noel Baker at the Commonwealth Relations Office presumed that an independent Newfoundland would soon run into financial difficulties. This view was not shared by Lord Beaverbrook, who had already stated publicly that a restored Dominion of Newfoundland had excellent prospects for financial prosperity. In addition, an elected Newfoundland government would have been in a very different position to address many issues not considered in the talks in Ottawa in 1948. To begin with, an elected Newfoundland government would have become aware of the true significance of the iron ore deposits in Labrador, elevating it immediately to a much stronger position in its negotiations with Ottawa. But that was precisely what C.D. Howe and Louis St. Laurent were so anxious to avoid. A Newfoundland government, especially one with a strong position, would have had to secure either development or a meaningful royalty for that iron ore. Then, as High Commissioner Scott MacDonald pointed out, there was the issue of the enormous per capita public debt of Canada, which Newfoundlanders would have to share if they entered Confederation. In 1948, the Canadian per capita debt was $1,068, and Newfoundland's was $238. Oh. At the conference called to discuss joining Confederation in 1895, the delegation from Newfoundland government had insisted that Canada take over the whole of Newfoundland's public debt as a condition of union. 5 decades later, MacDonald favored the same arrangement and argued to St. Laurent. The application now of the same criteria were applied to them in 1895 would result not only in the assumption of the whole public debt, but in the payment by the Canadian of the subsidy to compensate them for the amount by which the per capita debt of the Dominion exceeds that of Newfoundland. Interests on this amount, even computed at 3%, would come to several $1 million per annum. However, delegation from Governor Gordon MacDonald was in no position to make any such demands, especially given that the vote had already been taken. Similarly, although the terms of union carefully itemized every amount and source of revenue to be assumed by the Canadian government, there is no mention of the considerable revenue that the Canadian government would collect from Newfoundland's airspace. Newfoundland is on the flight path from North America to Europe, and even a conservative estimate states it has generated over $8 billion for the federal treasury since 1949. There was no discussion of these potential revenues in the talks or documents leading up to Confederation, but an elected government would surely have become aware of them. In the late 1940s or early 1950s, there are other issues too that would have arisen in negotiations between two independent countries, issues that could not arise in the carefully arranged negotiations, quotations, under British authority. Gordon Winters, the reluctant delegate who felt compelled to sign the final terms of 1948, was troubled by the event for the rest of his life. Before he died in 2003, he stated in an interview with CBC St. John's that, quote, there were no negotiations in Ottawa in 48. If responsible government had been restored, it is quite possible that Newfoundland would have become a province of Canada in the 50s, though one of the very different characters, not a pauper, P-A-U-P-E-R, to be saved, but a more equal and respected partner in a strong union. It is probable that a general election in 1948 or 1949 would have produced results similar to those in the referendum, with an evenly divided legislature, a minority pro-Confederate government under Smallwood, perhaps, or a minority pro-independent government under Major Peter Cashin, or something else. Either way, Canada would have had to make an attractive offer to be accepted. Certainly better than the one agreed by Governor MacDonald. The official correspondence between Canada and Great Britain proves that Newfoundland's rights to self-determine was not respected or handled in 1948 in a transparent, fair, and democratic fashion by those who led temporary authority over the island. The claim that Great Britain and Canada were involved in a conspiracy to put Newfoundland into Confederation without the knowledge of the people is now a fact, grounded in the evidence of their own official documents. This plot was unquestionably harmful to the Newfoundland's interests and reputation, as historian Philip McCann states in his groundbreaking article, British Policy and Confederation, the first work to seriously challenge the official history, the belief of Peter Cashin, and the responsible the British was engaged in a plot or conspiracy must be given greater credence. There can be little doubt that the situation which brought about Confederation was engineered by the British, almost entirely in secret and largely by the Treasury. Both Newfoundland and Labrador were used as pawns in a deal with the Canadians. And this brings us to the end of this chapter. Thank you.